It arrived on a Tuesday, quiet as a memory, an unmarked envelope, slipped between a grocery coupon and an overdue electricity bill. Claire didn't notice it at first, not until her fingers paused over its worn edge, and a strange familiarity fluttered in her chest like a whisper she'd almost forgotten how to hear. The green journal, the one she thought she'd lost forever, the one filled with late-night thoughts, unsent letters, and truths too fragile to speak, was inside. No note, no return address, only a single, looping line written at the bottom of the final page. Keep writing. She didn't know who had read those pages or how long it had taken them to send it back. But somehow, that single sentence carried more tenderness than most people had ever given her face to face. And she found herself wondering, what kind of stranger returns something so intimate and asks you not to stop being yourself? Claire Whitmore was the kind of woman who walked softly through the world, as if afraid her footsteps might wake something she'd finally managed to let sleep. At 46, she had learned how to live quietly, alone, but not lonely, tucked inside a 2-story house that leaned slightly to the left during snowstorms, just 3 blocks from the tiny Vermont library, where she worked part-time and never needed to raise her voice. People knew her as kind, competent, unfailingly calm, but no one asked about the stack of journals hidden in the bottom drawer of her desk, or why she always sat at the farthest table in the coffee shop, sipping her bitter coffee without cream or sugar, writing slowly in a notebook with a soft green cover. She had been married once, a long time ago, and loved gently. Too gently, perhaps, to hold someone who needed storms to feel alive. Since then, her days unfolded like pages in a familiar book. Morning tea with the radio humming 90s jazz, a quiet nod to Mrs. Rayner next door, then hours spent among the hush of bookshelves where stories whispered to her more clearly than most. People did. She collected handwritten letters, old stamps, pressed flowers in envelopes. She believed some things, like silence and sincerity, were still sacred. The journal, the green one, had disappeared on a wet Thursday, between a visit to the bakery and a sudden downpour. She'd looked for it, but half-heartedly, as if she knew it was gone for a reason. Losing it had felt like losing a part of herself, yet also like shedding something too heavy to carry. She'd told no one. Until now. And so, when it returned without warning, her life, so carefully balanced, shifted. Just slightly. Just enough to matter. If you could read your younger self's diary, would you? It came on a Wednesday, the kind of day Claire would forget by evening, folded between laundry loads and tea left cooling beside half-read pages of a novel she wasn't sure she liked. The air smelled faintly of rain and something older, like wood swollen from last week's storm. The envelope wasn't anything extraordinary. Cream-colored, slightly curved at the corners, slipped between a veterinary flyer and a notice about a missing cat. Had she not touched it by chance, fingers brushing the edge while searching for the electricity bill, she might have missed it entirely. But she did touch it, and something in her stilled. There was no return address, no sender. Only her name, in a handwriting that was neither rushed nor decorative, but deliberate, like it had been written by someone who had thought long and quietly before letting the ink meet the paper. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she set it beside the sink, beside the clean mugs, beside the life she had built so carefully from habits and quiet and almosts. The envelope sat there like it didn't belong, and yet, as the light shifted across the tiles and the kettle sighed behind her, she began to feel the unmistakable pull of something not yet named, but deeply familiar. It was the green journal. She didn't have to open it to know. The weight of it in her hands, the texture of the cloth cover, worn at the spine, edges soft from time and touch, was something her body remembered before her mind could fully catch up. She sat down slowly, letting her fingers trace the surface, pausing where the cover still bore the faint ring of her favorite mug, the one that chipped during the first winter alone. She had lost this journal on a Thursday, on a day that had begun like any other, with coffee, with clouds, with a mind too full to notice when something precious slipped through. She had looked, briefly, but deep down she had accepted its loss the way she had accepted other quiet goodbyes in her life, without drama, without words, with a practiced kind of ache. Now, without warning, it was back. And though she hadn't opened it yet, she already felt herself softening and tightening all at once, the way you do when someone calls you by a name you haven't heard in years, but still belongs to you. When she did finally lift the cover, the pages met her with the same intimacy they always had. Her own handwriting, slanted and sometimes impatient, stretched across each page like footprints on familiar ground. But it wasn't the writing that stopped her. It was the sentence, tucked at the bottom of the very last page, in a different hand, 4 words, written gently, with the kind of restraint that made them feel heavier somehow. Keep writing. Please. Do. That was all. There was no signature, no explanation, no other mark to suggest who had found the journal, who had read what she'd poured onto those pages on nights when silence wrapped too tightly around her chest. Claire didn't cry, not in the way one might expect, but something inside her gave way, not loudly, not suddenly, just the soft shift of a heart remembering how it once beat freely when no one was watching. She sat for a long time, the journal open in her lap, her fingers resting on the final page like they were afraid to smudge the ink. Outside, a sparrow landed on the windowsill, shook its feathers, and flew away again, as if the world would go on regardless of what this moment had meant to her. But she knew better, because sometimes a thing returns not to remind you of what was lost, but to ask whether you're ready to find yourself again. She didn't mean to keep reading, at least not all at once. Her plan, if you could call it that, was to skim the pages, close the journal, and tuck it away somewhere she wouldn't keep looking at it. But like most things Claire tried to handle, gently it slipped past her intentions and moved straight to her heart. One page led to another, and soon her eyes were trailing over memories written in a voice that felt both foreign and familiar. Her own, but softer, younger, still slightly. Bruised from hoping too much and guarding too little. It was strange, this mirror of thoughts. She remembered writing some of it, of course, the ache of certain days, the way her words curled around Daniel's name without ever quite saying it aloud. But other parts, they felt like finding footprints in the snow from a journey she didn't remember making. And then she saw it. It was just a line, one single line, tucked at the bottom of a page she had once left half blank, as if she couldn't finish the thought or hadn't been ready to. The handwriting was different, not jarringly so, but enough to make her pause. It wasn't hers. The letters sloped left instead of right, the ink just a shade darker than her usual pen, and the way the capital T was shaped. It hit her, with a quiet violence she hadn't prepared for. Daniel. Her breath caught in her throat in the strangest way, not like panic, not like grief, but like standing too close to something precious after so long pretending you didn't care if you ever touched it again. She leaned in, eyes scanning the sentence again, afraid she'd imagined it. I used to wonder if you wrote about me. That was it. No name, no signature, just that. A question once unsaid, now immortalized in ink on a page she'd tried to forget. She sat back, both hands still holding the journal as if it might fall away from her. Her heart was loud now, too loud for a quiet kitchen. She didn't move, didn't breathe, just stared at that one line, the loop of the Y in you. So unmistakably him that it didn't matter if her memory was wrong. It felt like Daniel, and that was enough to shake something loose inside her. It had been 14 years since she last saw him, 12 since they'd spoken. Their last conversation hadn't been a fight or a farewell. It was more like the Air had thinned between them until nothing remained to hold. Daniel had always been good at quiet exits. He slipped out of people's lives like songs fading into silence. No crashes, no echoes, just gone. And she, being who she was, had let him. Because back then, silence felt easier than begging someone to stay. But now, holding this journal, reading that line, she felt the ache of all the things they never said. She remembered the way he used to pause before answering big questions, how he'd run his thumb along the spine of whatever book he was pretending to read when he didn't want to meet her eyes. She remembered his voice, low, thoughtful, a little amused when she got flustered over words. He used to say she thought too much and felt too deeply, and maybe he'd been right. Claire brushed her thumb along the margin of the page, where his words lingered like the scent of something once worn close to the skin. A question lived there now, between the lines. Had he read it all? Every page? Every poem? Every confession she had meant for no one but the paper? It unsettled her and comforted her in equal measure that someone had seen her, fully, and instead of walking away, had written back. She didn't know what startled her more, the possibility that it was Daniel, or that the thought of it didn't hurt the way she expected it to. It felt warm, familiar, like sliding on an old coat and finding a love note in the pocket you'd forgotten was there. She closed the journal slowly, holding it to her chest, letting the silence fill the room again. Not empty, not echoing, but tender somehow. And then she whispered, without quite meaning to, "I don't know who sent this back, but the handwriting makes me feel safe." She didn't open it again that night. She didn't need to. But as she stood at the window later, watching the last light fold into the hills beyond Willow Creek, her hand still resting on the cover, she thought, "Have you ever recognized someone just by their handwriting?" The next morning, Claire rose earlier than usual, though she hadn't slept much. The journal lay beside her bed like an old friend returned from exile, its presence both calming and unnerving. She carried it with her to the kitchen, placed it carefully next to her cup of tea, and opened it with the reverence one might give to a letter from someone long gone. The pages were still faintly scented with rain, the kind that soaks not just your coat, but something deeper, more private. And she began to read again, not quickly, not searching for anything, but allowing each line to unfold in its own time. The entries were uneven in tone, some light and observational, like little sketches of her daily life, while others were weighted with longing she barely recognized as her own. Daniel's name didn't appear directly, but he was everywhere, in the way she described a voice heard across a bookstore aisle, in the silhouette of someone leaning against a railing in autumn light, in the sentence, "I didn't say anything, but he looked at me like he already knew." It was the kind of almost love that grows quietly in the margins, never spoken aloud, but pulsing just beneath the surface, vibrant in its restraint. She read about a moment in late October, 12 years ago, when she and Daniel had gone for a walk after closing the library. The entry was scattered, fragmented, as if her heart had been racing too fast for her pen to follow. "He offered to walk me home. Said he liked the way the town looked under fog. I said something about the moon, and he laughed like I'd told a joke, even though I hadn't meant to be funny. I thought he might kiss me outside the gate. He didn't. But he touched my arm when he said goodbye. I think that meant more." Claire let the journal rest in her lap, hands trembling ever so slightly, not from sadness, but from the weight of memory being suddenly, unmistakably alive. She had forgotten how much detail she used to notice, how someone's hands moved, how they paused before saying her name. And Daniel, more than anyone, had lived in those details. He had never confessed anything plainly, but he had lingered, listened, let silence stretch between them like thread waiting to be pulled, and she had let it go slack. As the morning light shifted across the floorboards, Claire poured a second cup of tea, this time forgetting to add the sugar she usually skipped anyway. She carried the journal to the living room, sat curled in the faded armchair by the window, and continued reading as the world outside softened into mist. Each page brought back echoes of herself, versions she barely remembered being. There were days when she had been brave, writing lines like, "I don't need him to say it. I can feel it when he stays a little longer than he has to." And other days when her ink trembled with hesitation. What if I'm only something to pass? The time between who he loved before and who he will love next. These were not dramatic confessions. They were quieter than that, more dangerous in their stillness. They held all the weight of what was never spoken. In the middle of the journal, pressed between two entries written weeks apart, she found a dried clover. Its color had faded, its edges curled, but the memory bloomed instantly. It was from the day she and Daniel had gone to that old farmer's market out of town, the one with honey jars and faded maps and books for 50 cents apiece. He had plucked the clover from a crack in the pavement, handed it to her like it meant something, and she had tucked it into her pocket, pretending not to smile. She never wrote about that day. Not directly. But she remembered now. Remembered how he had looked at her over a chipped teacup, how he had said, "You always look like you're about to say something important," and how she hadn't responded, too afraid the thing she might say would ruin everything. The front door creaked as Mrs. Rayner, her elderly neighbor, let herself in without knocking, something she'd done for years, usually with a plate of something warm. Today, it was lemon muffins. "You're quiet this week," the older woman said, setting the plate down gently. Claire smiled and nodded, motioning toward the journal without explaining. She wouldn't have known where to begin. "Did I ever tell you?" Mrs. Rayner began, seating herself with a small groan. "About the man who used to leave me little poems in my glove compartment?" Claire looked up. He worked at the post office. Married someone else, of course. But every now and then I still look in my glove box and wonder if he left one more. They sat in silence after that. Two women with full lives behind them, holding space for all that had never been, said. That evening, after Mrs. Rayner had left and the house had returned to its familiar hush, Claire went to the hallway cupboard, the one she rarely opened, the one that still smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. She reached behind stacked photo albums and a dusty knitting kit she had once intended to gift herself with time. There, wrapped in a tea towel with fraying edges, was a smaller, older journal, its cover dark blue, almost black, and the corners slightly torn from years of being. Moved but never read again. She had written it when she turned 30, a year that had felt like standing on the threshold of something she never quite dared to enter. She hadn't planned on opening it. But her hands, as they so often did lately, moved before her thoughts, could catch up. The writing inside was thinner, more slanted, messier, as if her younger self had been trying to outrun something. She flipped through the pages, recognizing moments long buried. The anxiety of moving into her own apartment after the separation, the way her mother's voice had grown softer with age but still carried disappointment in its silences. The first time she met Daniel, which she hadn't remembered writing about at all. It was written in late spring. He asked me if I believed in timing. I said yes, too quickly. And I think he noticed. Claire smiled, even as her chest tightened. She had forgotten how hopeful she had been at 30. Hopeful, but guarded. She kept reading, stopping only when she reached a line on the left-hand side of a nearly empty page. It was scrawled, not neatly, and underlined twice. If he ever comes back, I'll know. She read it again, and again. For a moment, the air felt too still, like the room itself had leaned in to listen. She didn't remember writing it. Not the phrasing, not the urgency. It was the kind of line that belongs in a novel, not in the quiet, crumpled thoughts of someone trying to heal, but it was there, in her own hand, and it unnerved her, because she wasn't sure now if she did know. The journal had returned. A message had been written, but nothing was certain. Not anymore. She closed the book gently, pressing her palm to its cover as if she could absorb the answer through her skin. The past wasn't linear, she thought. It folded back on itself, tangled and soft, like fabric worn from too much holding, and, in the smallest, most private part of her, something whispered, "I used to believe I'd know, but now, I'm not so sure." The next few days unfolded like fog, not heavy enough to blind her, but thick enough to make every movement feel slower, more deliberate. Claire found herself moving through her routines with the journal never far from reach, not clutched as a relic of grief, but held gently, like a thread she was still afraid to pull. She reread old entries during breakfast, lingered over them. In the quiet of early afternoon, when the library sat empty and time seemed to slow in sympathy with her thoughts. What struck her more than anything was not just what she had written, but the voice she had written with. There had been a girl there once, behind all those words, uncertain, yes, but open. A girl who still believed she could say what she wanted and be loved anyway. Now, she wasn't so sure. She paused often in her reading, not because she was tired, but because the weight of remembering took more breath than she had expected. There was a quiet cruelty in realizing how easily we outgrow the tenderness we once offered ourselves. It wasn't just Daniel she mourned as she moved through the pages. It was the version of herself who had once dared to believe she mattered, enough to be written about, to be chosen, to be remembered. The journal didn't give her answers, not really, but it left clues. A phrase here, a scribbled date there, things that pointed toward what might have been. There were more mentions of Daniel than she remembered, though never by name, always tucked into scenes like whispers. He lingered when he didn't have to. He knew how I liked my coffee before I ever said it. He asked if I'd ever lived by the sea. That one line made her stop, made her place the book down, close her eyes, and remember a moment she had nearly lost. Standing by the window of his apartment, the two of them watching the storm roll in over the mountains. His voice sang, "Someday I'll take you to the coast, just to see how you look under a salt sky." He never did. That, perhaps, was the most Daniel thing of all. The promise hidden in a passing thought, never spoken as a vow, never meant to be held against him. And yet, Claire had held on to it, quietly, like a seashell tucked into a coat, pocket she never emptied. On the fifth morning, Claire didn't open the journal right away. She sat by the window with her tea, watching the bare trees tremble slightly in the wind. The light was pale, the sky undecided, and the house felt like it was holding its breath with her. There was something delicate about the moment. Not fragile, not sad, but full of something unspoken. She let herself sit in it, unhurried. For years, she had rushed through mornings, through feelings, through silences, as if anything unspoken might explode if left unattended. But now she allowed herself to linger, to settle into the quiet and let it speak before she did. When she did open the journal again, she didn't turn to a random page. Her fingers moved with a kind of instinct, guided by memory or muscle or something deeper, and they stopped at a page that had no date, no context, just a line of thought written in the middle of the paper. Some people arrive quietly, stay gently, and leave you with everything. She stared at it for a long time. The ink was faded but not old. This wasn't something she had written in her 30s, or even her 40s. It had been recent, maybe weeks before she lost the journal, maybe days. And she couldn't, for the life of her, remember writing it. But she could feel herself in it. The softness, the ache, the kind of understanding that comes not from grief, but from living through it. It sounded like someone who had finally stopped waiting for a grand gesture, who had begun to notice the quiet ones instead. the ones that looked like someone handing you a pen instead of promising forever. And then, almost without thinking, she reached for a notebook she hadn't used in years. A blank one, tucked deep in a drawer beneath old postcards and takeout menus she never threw away. It had a linen cover, soft gray, a little dust on the corners. She opened it, felt the crispness of its untouched pages, and without letting herself think too long, she began to write. Not about Daniel, not directly. She wrote about the window, the sea she never saw, the handwritten note in the journal. She wrote about how you can miss someone and still not want them back, how love and silence sometimes coexist like rain and morning. One doesn't cancel the other out. She wrote about a girl who never got her answers, and about a woman who no longer needed them to feel whole. For the first time in years, she didn't write to forget. She wrote to remember. She paused only once, mid-sentence, her hand still holding the pen. Across the room, the old journal lay closed but not put away. The green cover still held its shape, but inside, it had already begun to change her. Haichai realized then that it didn't matter whether Daniel had written in it. What mattered was that someone, somewhere, had returned it without erasing what she'd placed inside. Someone had looked at her rawest words and chosen not to turn away. Someone had said, "Keep writing," and she had. It was Emily who noticed it first. Claire hadn't intended to share the journal with her daughter. There were some things mothers don't hand over, not because they are shameful, but because they are too sacred, too delicate, like lace so old. It might disintegrate under the weight of new hands. But that evening, as they sat on the back porch sipping tea, Emily had asked gently, "Is everything okay with you lately, Mom? You seem different." Claire had smiled and replied honestly, "Something came back to me," and she handed over the journal. Emily didn't read it, not properly, just flipped through, noting the handwriting, the layout, the age of the ink. Then, without hesitation, she tapped her phone, took a quick picture of the final page, the one with the line in the different hand, and said, "This isn't yours, right?" Claire shook her head. Emily frowned thoughtfully, squinting at the photo. "This reminds me of someone. The T's curve like, wait, this looks like Greg's handwriting. You remember Greg? Dad's friend? He used to come over for dinner sometimes. Before the divorce." Claire's body stiffened slightly. Greg. She hadn't thought of him in years. He had always been the quiet type, witty in that dry, blink-and-you-miss-it way. He never stayed long, never said much, but he had been kind, courteous. One of those people you don't notice until they're gone, and then wonder why you never looked closer. Greg, Claire repeated slowly, the name tasting both familiar and foreign. "He used to work in publishing, didn't he?" Emily nodded. "And he had a thing for old books, remember? He once gave me a second-hand copy of The Secret Garden with a note inside." Claire's fingers tightened around the mug. Something shifted. The memory of Greg sitting quietly in their old living room, a glass of red wine in hand, flipping through. One of her notebooks, not the journal but something else, came rushing back. He had always been interested in her writing. He'd once asked, half-jokingly, why she didn't publish any of it. She'd shrugged then, embarrassed. "It's just for me," she had said. He had smiled, but said nothing more. Now, years later, his silence didn't feel empty. It felt full of something held gently, then returned at the exact moment it was needed most. That night, long after Emily had gone back to school and the house had returned to its familiar hush, Claire went digging. She pulled out a box she hadn't opened in nearly a decade, labeled simply "Old Photos Pre-Divorce" in her handwriting, sharp and angular from a time when she still believed labeling would somehow keep her life in order. Inside were birthday snapshots, Polaroids of beach trips, school recitals, and the odd out-of-focus shot of herself caught mid-laugh or mid-thought. She hadn't expected to find anything remarkable. But near the bottom, in a yellowed envelope labeled Thanksgiving, 2009, there it was, a photo of Greg and Daniel, sitting side by side on the back steps, heads bowed over something on Daniel's knee. Claire leaned in. It wasn't a plate of food or a phone, it was a journal. Her journal, the green one. Daniel was holding it, but Greg's finger was pointing to something on the page. His mouth caught mid-sentence, eyes focused not on the camera, but on the words. Her breath caught, quiet and full. The moment was so casually captured, so natural that it almost escaped her memory. But now, framed by everything she'd read and felt in the past few days, it struck her like a confession. Daniel had shared it. With Greg. Maybe not intentionally, maybe not with gravity. Perhaps it was a careless moment, or perhaps it was deliberate. Daniel, trying to understand something he couldn't ask her outright. But Greg had read it. And if what Emily believed was true, if Greg was the one who had written that line, "Keep writing. Please do," then it wasn't just a return. It was an offering, a bridge between past and present. Claire placed the photo on the table, staring at it long after the light in the kitchen had grown dim. There was something tender in the idea that two men from her past, one who had left without words, and one who had always stayed just enough out of reach, had once sat together, reading something she'd thought no one would ever understand. And maybe, just maybe, Greg had carried that understanding with him all this time. The next morning, Claire stood at the counter with the photo in one hand and the journal in the other. The kettle was boiling, but she didn't move to silence it. Her mind had wandered into that photograph. Two men, a journal, a sliver of a moment preserved like a pressed flower between pages. And she couldn't stop wondering what had been said, if anything. Had Daniel shared it casually, like a page, torn from a novel that confused him? Or had he handed it over carefully, wordlessly asking someone else to carry what he couldn't? She didn't have Greg's number anymore. They hadn't spoken since well before the divorce, before the silence between her and Daniel had turned into something permanent. But a quick search online turned up an address, a small editorial house in Burlington, still listed under his name. She stared at the listing for a long time, fingers hovering over the keyboard, before closing the laptop without sending a message. Not yet. She didn't know what she would say, not exactly. And something in her felt that this wasn't about chasing answers. It was about recognizing the ones already placed gently in her path. That afternoon, she walked to the library under a pale sun, the kind that made everything look softer than it really was. She shelved books half-heartedly, her mind a swirl of memories and imagined conversations. And when the room fell into its usual 3 p.m. hush, she returned to her desk, opened the journal, and flipped to the page. The page with the writing not her own. She read the line again and again. "I used to wonder if you wrote about me." And below that, now with a fresh lens, the closing line. "Keep writing. Please do." The emotion wasn't sharp anymore. It didn't cut the way it had the first time she read it. Now it settled over her like a soft ache, the kind you don't want to leave because it reminds you that something once mattered. Maybe Greg hadn't needed to sign his name. Maybe he knew she would recognize something in the gesture, if not the handwriting. Or maybe it wasn't about him at all. Maybe it was about Daniel, about giving someone else the chance to return what he himself never could. Claire sat back, the journal open before her, and whispered into the stillness of the room. Maybe. Love doesn't always come back in the same shape it left. She closed her eyes. That evening, Claire didn't write. Not in the new journal, not in any margin or sticky note or blank space that might usually invite her hand. Instead, she folded laundry slowly, ran her fingers along the seams of old sweaters, made soup from scratch. She did ordinary things with a reverence usually reserved for moments of clarity, and somehow that felt like writing too. Like living gently was also a form of story she had forgotten how to tell. She let the green journal rest on her nightstand, closed but close. She no longer feared losing it again, not because she believed it was safe, but because something inside her had shifted. What had once been fragile now felt rooted. The pages had changed her, yes, but not just in the way they'd revealed her past. They had mirrored her forward too, offering not closure, but a kind of compass. Not answers, but permission. In the quiet hour between dusk and full dark, she opened an old email inbox she hadn't used in years, the one tied to her writing group from long ago. She didn't know what she was looking for, not really, but when she typed Greg into the search bar, a message surfaced. The subject line read, "That piece about the garden." It was dated April 2010. Claire clicked it open with a trembling kind of curiosity. "Claire," it began, "I hope you don't mind. I read a few pages of your notebook that Daniel left out last weekend. I don't know if you meant for anyone to see them, but they stayed with me. The way you describe silence, it felt like I'd never heard it that way before. You said something about how real love is often the part no one says out loud. I've been thinking about that all week." There was no signature, just his name, typed plainly at the bottom. Greg. She read the message 3 times before closing the laptop. Not because she was overwhelmed, but because the feeling wasn't sharp anymore. It was rounder now, like river stones shaped by time. Quiet, solid, enduring. She didn't need to write him back. She didn't even need to see him again. What mattered was that someone, even just once, had seen the pieces of her she thought only the paper knew and carried them carefully into the future. That night, sleep came to Claire not as an escape, but as a companion. Her dreams were quiet, not haunted by old memories, but gently threaded with images of things unfinished. Pages half-filled, voices speaking without words, the feeling of a hand resting on a table near hers but never quite touching. And when she woke, just before dawn, she felt something unfamiliar humming beneath her ribs. Not closure, but calm. The kitchen was still cold when she padded in, wrapping her cardigan tighter as she turned on the kettle. There was something sacred about the morning, she'd always thought. A hush before the world demanded explanations. She sat at the small table with her tea and opened the new journal, not to write, but to reread the few entries she'd started over the past days. Her handwriting had changed, she noticed. Not dramatically, but subtly. The letters more grounded, less hurried. Like even her script had begun to believe it had time. Across the table, the green journal remained closed, its weight no longer heavy, just present. Like a stone in the riverbed of her life, not impeding the current, just part of its shape. She ran her fingers along its spine once more, not searching for meaning, but offering thanks. For the silence it had held, for the voice it had helped her find again, for the person she used to be and the one she was becoming now, and for Greg. Not as a what if, not even as a maybe once, but as a witness. Someone who had held a version of her, quietly, with care, and returned it to her when she needed it most. He hadn't interrupted her life. He had nudged it, gently, respectfully, like someone placing a book back on the shelf it belonged to, hoping its story might continue. Later that morning, Claire stepped outside. The air was crisp, the kind that tingles at the edges of your breath. She walked to the post office, not to send anything, but to stand in line, to be among people, to feel the world as it moved around her. She bought a single sheet of stamps she didn't need, smiled at a woman in a navy coat, and paused at the community board to read a flyer about a poetry reading the following Friday. She thought she might go, not because she needed to be heard, but because maybe, just maybe, she was ready to listen again. The rain came late that night, as if the sky itself had waited until every light in the neighborhood dimmed before allowing itself to weep. Claire sat by the window, not reading, not writing, just watching the droplets trace slow, uncertain paths down the glass. In the soft glow of the lamp, the room took on a kind of softness that made her feel both held and hollow, like she existed within the echo of a lullaby. No one was singing anymore. The green journal was closed, resting quietly beneath the gray. One now, not buried, not hidden, just done. She no longer opened it. She no longer needed to. What she needed, though she couldn't quite admit it aloud, was space to grieve not just what had been lost, but what she had never reached for when it was still within arm's length. It wasn't Daniel she missed. Not exactly. It wasn't even Greg, though his gesture had stirred something she hadn't let surface in years. What she mourned, quietly, painfully, was the woman she might have been if she had let herself speak just one sentence sooner, hold just one look longer, ask for just one truth while there was still time to hear it. She remembered one night vividly. Now, though she hadn't thought of it in years, Daniel leaning against her kitchen counter, wine glass in hand, the conversation drifting from music to memory to nothing at all. At one point, he had looked at her with a softness she hadn't known how to meet, and she had turned away, pretended to check the oven timer, pretended not to notice that he had been about to say something. She had told herself even then that silence was safer than disappointment. She had been wrong. What she felt now wasn't regret in the loud cinematic sense. It was something much smaller, a quiet knowing, a stillness that had settled into her bones. She had had the chance to reach, and she hadn't. Not because the love wasn't there, but because she didn't believe she was allowed to ask for more than what was silently offered. The clock ticked beside her, each second a small confession of time she hadn't spent well. The music from the radio, some old instrumental piece she couldn't name, looped gently in the background, like a thought she kept returning to but couldn't quite complete. The house was still, too still. And for the first time in weeks, Claire allowed herself to feel the full weight of the loneliness she had so carefully kept at bay. She didn't cry. Not with sound, but her eyes blurred, not from pain, but from the exhaustion of holding herself together. She rose from the window sometime after midnight, not because she wanted to sleep, but because she had nowhere else to be. The bedroom was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the hallway lamp she never turned off, an old habit from the years Emily was small and afraid of the dark. Now, the light served no practical purpose. It was just there, a sliver of warmth in a house that had grown used to whispering to itself. Claire sat at the edge of the bed, one hand resting on the green journal though she didn't open it. The linen sheets beneath her were cool, her body heavy with a kind of quiet that didn't beg to be broken. Outside, the rain had softened to a whisper, and the ticking clock on her nightstand felt almost too loud. She stared at the shadows on the far wall and thought, not of Daniel, but of herself, at 30, at 35, at 43. How many moments had she sat exactly like this, hoping for something to arrive, a message, a knock, a memory that might rearrange what she thought she understood? And how many times had she met only silence and mistaken it for peace? The truth came to her slowly, like light returning to a shuttered room. She hadn't lost love. Not really. What she had lost was the chance to believe in her own worth while it was still being offered. She had played small in the name of safety. She had chosen restraint and called it grace. And in doing so, she had let entire seasons of possibility pass untouched, unopened, unspoken. And the deepest ache of all wasn't that Daniel had left, or that Greg had stayed silent. It was that somewhere along the way, she had stopped asking for more. She had stopped believing she was allowed to. There is a particular kind of heartbreak that doesn't come from endings, but from stillness. When the story never begins, when, The door is left ajar, but no one steps through. That was what sat beside her now. Not absence, but what might have been. Not grief, but what she had denied herself out of habit, out of fear, out of not knowing how to want something aloud. Her fingers drifted to the edge of the journal again, and this time she did open it, not to read, but to touch the final page one more time. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were still there. Keep writing. Please do. Claire traced them lightly, as if memorizing the weight of each letter, the silence between them. Then she closed the journal, turned off the light, and lay back into the dark, letting it wrap around her. Not as a threat, but as truth. She didn't cry. Not anymore. Not tonight. Some losses are too quiet for tears. They live in the spaces between breath and memory, in the rooms we enter alone, carrying stories we never got to speak. And sometimes, the saddest thing is not what was taken, but what we never dared to hold. It came on a Thursday morning, quiet and cold. The sky outside was a flat gray, the kind that made everything feel paused, as if the day itself were holding its breath. Claire had just finished rinsing her tea mug when she noticed the envelope. On the floor, slipped halfway through the mail slot, slightly bent at the edge. There was no sender, just her name, written in a hand that was neither hurried nor practiced, simple, deliberate. She picked it up and stared at it for a moment longer than necessary, unsure why the paper felt heavier than it should. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she placed it on the kitchen table and moved around it, tending to the cat, refolding a blanket that didn't need folding, dusting a shelf already clean. But the envelope sat there, patient, unchanging, like a silence she hadn't yet dared to break. When she finally opened it, her hands were steady but slow. Inside was a photograph, worn at the edges, its color softened by time. The image was familiar, unmistakably so. Her, seated on the bench in the courtyard behind the library, head bent over her journal, hair twisted into that loose knot she always wore when she didn't expect to be seen. Her face was mid-smile, unposed, unaware, caught in a moment she hadn't even known was being watched, and on the back, written in small, almost hesitant blue ink, were the words, "This is the day I fell in love with her. I never told her. But I kept this photo because I wanted to remember what it felt like to be near someone who still believed in things." There was no signature, no date, no clue to confirm what her heart already knew. Her breath left her slowly, not in shock, but in something far softer, something like release. She sat down, gently, letting the photo rest in her palm, and read the words again. The sentence wasn't long. It wasn't poetic. But it held something more honest than any love letter she had ever received. Her mind sifted through the years, trying to place the exact moment. That day, that courtyard. She remembered the breeze, the scent of something warm, cinnamon maybe, from the cafe window. She remembered Daniel bringing her coffee, and Greg sitting beside her, not speaking much, just flipping through a manuscript, their knees almost touching but never quite. She hadn't written about that day. She hadn't thought there was anything to remember. But someone had. Someone had held on to it all these years. Claire brought the photo closer to her chest and closed her eyes, not to cry, but to listen, to the echo of a moment she hadn't even known had mattered. And it did matter. It mattered because for the first time she realized she had been loved in silence, that someone had looked at her not as a maybe, or a placeholder, or an almost, but as a certainty they didn't dare disturb. And maybe, she thought, that was the kind of love that lives longest, the one that never asks to be answered, only remembered. The photo remained on the table for hours. Claire didn't rush to tuck it away or frame it or turn it into something symbolic. It stayed there, slightly curled at the corners, catching the golden drift of afternoon light through the kitchen window, as if the moment it had captured all those years ago was unfolding again, quietly, without asking for permission. She found herself glancing at it while slicing apples, while boiling water, while feeding the cat. It was a silent presence, but no longer a ghost. The weight of it wasn't heavy. It was grounding. A tether to something she hadn't known she'd needed. Confirmation not that she had been desired, but that she had been seen. Truly, unmistakably, even if only for a brief moment. Even if that moment had been held in someone else's hands all these years. Later, when she sat at her desk in the corner of the living room, Claire opened her journal. Not the green one. She hadn't touched that in days. But the soft gray one, the one that still smelled faintly of fresh paper and ink. She turned to a blank page, letting her fingers rest lightly on the edge, and breathed in the silence of the room. Then she wrote, slowly, deliberately. Someone once loved me, and I didn't know it. Someone once carried a version of me in their pocket, folded between silence and timing, and I never felt it. Until now. She paused, then continued. And perhaps that's enough. Not because I don't wish it had been different, but because knowing this now changes the story I tell myself. About being forgettable, about being unloved, about being invisible. The words weren't perfect. They didn't try to be. But they were true. And for the first time in a long time, Claire didn't feel like she was writing to fill an absence. She was writing to honor something that had been there all along, just out of sight. Later that evening, she took the photo and slipped it gently into the back pocket of her journal. Not hidden, not displayed, just there, close enough to return to if needed, far enough to let go. She didn't try to find out who had sent it. She didn't need to. Love, she had come to understand, wasn't always meant to be chased to its source. Sometimes it was enough to know it had existed, that it had touched her life quietly, respectfully, and then stepped aside when the moment passed. And in a strange way, that truth was more comforting than any declaration could have been. Because this kind of love, the unspoken, unannounced kind, wasn't about possession or timing. It was about recognition. About someone seeing you in your truest form and choosing to remember you that way, even when the world moved on. Claire stood by the window just before bed, cup of tea cooling in her hands, and watched the lights flicker across the street. Oh? Couple walked past, hands tucked into each other's coats, and she didn't flinch, didn't long for what they had. She simply watched, heart still but awake, and whispered to the room that once held only her voice. I was loved. Not loudly, not forever, but enough. There was a new stillness in Claire's life, but it didn't feel like absence anymore. It felt, instead, like a space she had finally cleared. Not by erasing the past, but by gently folding it into something she could carry. Not a burden, not a wound. Just a story she no longer needed to rewrite. In the weeks that followed the photo, she returned to her writing in a different way. Not for closure, not even for clarity, but for company. She wrote in the mornings beside the window with light slipping through the lace curtains. In the evenings, curled up with a blanket and the distant hum of the radio. The words didn't always come easily, but when they did, they no longer sounded like someone reaching backward. They sounded like someone standing quietly in the present, letting the world be what it was. Imperfect, unfinished, but still worth noticing. She wrote about the sound of leaves outside her window and how they scraped gently across the roof like fingers remembering. She wrote about Mrs. Rayner's hands, how they shook when she poured tea but never spilled a drop. She wrote about her daughter, who had grown into a woman while she wasn't looking, and who now called every Sunday just to ask what her mother was reading. And once, without meaning to, she wrote the sentence, I think I am learning to love, without waiting to be chosen. She stared at that line for a long time, then underlined it, softly, once. Claire never wrote back to Greg. She never asked if it was his photo or his note. She didn't reach for closure because, in some deep place, inside her she already had it. Sometimes she thought, healing doesn't look like a door closing. Sometimes it's the quiet knowing that you've stopped checking to see if it's still ajar, and that knowing, that peace, became the most precious part of her days. She didn't seek a new beginning. She simply let the old one become whole. And for the first time in years, her silence didn't feel like waiting. It felt like rest. Spring arrived quietly that year. It didn't burst through the branches or paint the streets with drama. It crept in gently, with lighter mornings and the soft return of birdsong just before dawn. Claire noticed it first, not through the calendar, but through the way the air changed when she opened the window. Something subtle had shifted. The world smelled new again, but not urgent. Just willing. One afternoon, she wandered into the second-hand bookstore tucked behind the train station, the one she used to visit in her 20s when she still believed love could be found between pages. The bell above the door chimed the same sweet, tinny note, and the place smelled of old ink and eucalyptus from the soaps they sold near the register. She ran her fingers over the spines out of habit, not searching, simply touching. In the back corner, on the bottom shelf, she found a slim volume of poetry, the kind with no barcode, no flashy cover, just a title embossed in fading gold, Of People Who Stayed Too Quiet. She smiled, placed it gently in her basket, and didn't open it until she got home. That night, she read 3 poems aloud to the walls, not because anyone was listening, but because the words deserved to be heard. The next morning, she did something unexpected. She placed the green journal in a small cardboard box, along with a note, not long, just a few lines. This was once mine. It taught me how to lose, and then how to begin again. If it finds you, I hope it reminds you of something worth returning to. Then she left the box at the community library's donation table, not because she no longer needed it, but because she no longer needed to keep it. Some stories, she'd come to believe, aren't meant to be held forever. They're meant to be passed along, like postcards without names, like songs half-remembered, like kindness from strangers who never asked to be known. Claire didn't look back when she walked away. She didn't wonder who might pick it up next. She didn't try to imagine whether someone would read her words and feel less alone. She just walked. Down the sidewalk, lined with cherry blossoms beginning to bloom, hands in her coat pockets, the morning sun warming her collarbone. And as she passed the cafe window, the same one where she had once watched Daniel pour coffee without knowing how long he'd stay, she caught her own reflection in the glass. Not younger. Not different. Just clearer. And for the first time, it didn't matter what she had lost, because she had chosen to stay with herself. If this story stayed with you, even just a little, don't forget to subscribe for more quiet, emotional moments like this one. We tell stories for those who believe in almosts, second chances, and love that lingers in the silence. Hit subscribe and join us next week for another letter, another memory, another heart still learning how to heal.